Okay.
So I've started the recording too.
Okay, excellent. So maybe we should, in the interest of time, everyone is racing from one Zoom to a next, start now. Is that good with everybody? Okay, excellent. Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice's Fall 2020 Colloquium, the University and the Carceral State Conversations on Anti-Racism, Decolonization, and Abolitionism. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lara Karian. I'm an associate professor in the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Carleton University. And today I'm here to welcome our amazing speakers, our amazing audience, on behalf of all of my colleagues at the ICCJ. And although we're gathered online for this event, and I'm sure we're potentially spread out all over the globe, the ICCJ would like to acknowledge that Carleton University's campus occupies the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. And this land acknowledgement is inspired by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. And it serves as a reminder that this territory remains unceded and that the university and the broader context within which we live, work, love, but are also governed is inextricably linked to the deep-seated and ongoing repression and oppression of Indigenous peoples. And this land acknowledgement is just one step in towards honoring the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have owned and cared for this land upon which we are uninvited settlers, such as myself, have benefited and continue to benefit. So the systemic and institutionalized oppression and privilege that is a product of this ongoing colonization, and as well as systemic racism is what we're gathered here today to discuss and learn towards, learn about how to work towards dismantling. So today with us, we have a question in particular about how the university as well as criminology departments can move towards racial justice, decolonization, carceral minimalism, and abolitionism. And we have with us two of the most well-respected Indigenous legal and criminology scholars that you could ask for to talk about this topic. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the format, and then I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. I am going to introduce them next. We're then going to turn the floor over to both of our amazing speakers, who will each have 20 minutes. And then following that, we are going to be opening up the floor to question and answer. So also like to take this moment to acknowledge my colleague, Alex, who will be working the question and answer board, and also to Jeff Monahan, who is the Colloquium chair, who really managed to pull all this beautiful collaborative conversation together. So my introductions are going to do a complete disservice to both women. For more information, please do go to their individual websites or read their amazing books and articles. But I'm going to start first with Pamela Palmiter. Pamela is a Mi'kmaq lawyer, author, and social justice activist from the Eel River Bar First Nation. She has 4 university degrees, count them 4, including a doctorate in law, and has worked with First Nations for more than 25 years, advancing Native education, sovereignty, and nation building. She currently holds the position of professor and chair of Indigenous governance at Ryerson University, where she specializes in Aboriginal governance and justice and Indigenous law. And her numerous publications, including her book Beyond Blood, Rethinking Indigenous Identity, are core reading for any criminology or Indigenous or, just any sort of field that is thinking through decolonization in the university. In addition to that book, she's got 2 collections of writings, Warrior Life, Indigenous Resistance and Resurgence, and Indigenous Nationhood, Empowering Grassroots Citizens. Both of these are collections of the numerous op-eds, blog posts, other political writings that she does, and they are an invaluable resource for individuals thinking through decolonization. She's been recognized by many awards for her social justice advocacy, including her work related to murdered and missing Indigenous women. She hosts her own YouTube channel, the Warrior Life podcast, as well as Warrior Kids podcast, which I just have to give a great shout out to for those big people in the world who are taking care of their little people in this pandemic and uprising, and are looking for educational resources. So thank you so much to Pamela for being here. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Michelle Brown, and it was Dr. Pamela Palmiter, in case I didn't mention that. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Michelle Brown. She is also an internationally recognized criminologist and professor of sociology at the University of Tennessee. Her research focuses on the carceral state, law and society, abolitionism, and transformative justice. And also countervisual tactics to anti-violence organizing. She is the author of The Culture of Punishment. She is the co-editor of the Routledge International Handbook of Visual Criminology, the Oxford Encyclopedia of Crime, Media, and Popular Culture, and the Palgrave MacMillan Crime, Media, and Culture book series. Just looking through the website, you know, her forthcoming publications, I mean, as exciting as everything that she's done to this point is, and amazing and impactful as it's been, some of her forthcoming publications are also just hugely important for all of us interested in this topic to consider. They're looking specifically more at racialized US politics, more transformative justice, new abolitionism, and public criminology. So bound to be essential criminological reading for any department. She's also the recipient of numerous awards for her research. So I am, you know, beyond excited to welcome both these individuals. I will stop my conversation at this point now and turn it over. I think we're just going in alphabetical order to Michelle, who will share some comments with us.
Great. Hi, everyone. So let me begin just by reiterating my own land acknowledgement as well, including the fact that not only are we gathered around Algonquin territory, where you are, but where I am in Eastern Tennessee is the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Eastern Band of Cherokee. And it continues in the formation of our university here as well. So I would also just like to say it's so nice to be back with you all in Ottawa, even though I can't be there. And I so wish I were. A special thanks to Jeff, Ilara, Kanika, Alex, and the ICCJ for organizing us today around questions that I'm really excited about and feel are incredibly urgent. I want to get straight to them in part because I'm here to hear Pamela today. So I want to get quickly to what she has to say. What I'm going to focus on, at least in the few minutes I have, is what I see as a set of questions that may help bring us closer to a structural analysis of the university and criminology in relationship to the carceral state that I'm working through at a moment that I view, and I think many of us do, as a complete reckoning, right? In a moment, in an unending project, I would argue, of abolition that's been going on for a long time and will continue to do so. So there's lots of words in our current moment, like reimagining, transforming, disbanding, disarming, defunding, decolonizing, reform, abolition. And I think we really do want to increasingly try to be more precise with those terms, but I think also they're attached to a lot of feelings and understandings and perceptions that are not complete yet. So I would just remind us, I think it's okay for us to have horizons and visions, going back to the visionary, and it's okay that we're not there yet, but it is urgent and essential that we do the work to move through. So the question that the ICCJ is posing is an interesting one because they're asking, you know, very clearly how the university should support our efforts in challenging all these things that add up to conquest, colonization, the carceral state. And I think part of that answer, at least for me, begs another, which is what forms the carceral takes within the university and beyond in terms of how the university extends. So I think there's a number of immediate sorts of goals that we're hearing in these kinds of discussions, goals that I too am advocating for in my area of the world, and that I would support, that do look like things like reduced tuition, fellowships, assistantships, specifically for BIPOC students and students who face depression, a concentration of resources in autonomous divisions and units such as the Human Rights Office or Diversity and Pride offices. And I'm someone who's also equally very critical and skeptical of diversity initiatives for all the things that I imagine we know in terms of how they're very superficially implemented and can be used against us. But I do think they are also nonetheless holding spaces within the university that are important. And we at Tennessee, for instance, have experienced our Office of Diversity and Pride Office being shut down, and we did fight to bring it back. And did. There's also a demand, I think, for transparency and public info about basic practices. What are police doing on our campuses? What kinds of surveillance are being used? What do safety strategies look like, and what are their effects? What are the budgets that are involved with that? Really pragmatic questions that I think are very important for us, and I think do a kind of work. They're a crowding out effort, which I think is important to abolition work. A crowding out effort that moves things out as they try and focus on other kinds of resources. But as we all know, they can be easily co-opted until we've hit a tipping point into transformation. So I guess one thing I would say is that our work continues whether the university supports us or not. And so we don't stop in connection with these sorts of things. And that's because the carceral state runs parallel in its foundations to the university. They share historical underpinnings in conquest, colonization, and certainly in our part of the world, slavery. So rethinking the university, in my mind, is more specifically rethinking the project of education as something that extends beyond the university as a popular political commitment and involves certain forms of political education. So I would also add, right, look at our moment, right, our context globally in terms of austerity, in terms of COVID, in terms of climate emergency, in terms of the rise of the far right and white supremacy, point us to other starting points as well in all of this. And part of what I think in terms of thinking about the forms of the carceral in relationship to the university, I think that is going to require organizing against neoliberal and corporate models that are intervening at every level of our university. So yes, we do want cops off campus. And we want to create safe spaces, but that's going to involve a lot more. It's going to involve intervening with audit cultures and kind of the unending set of metrics and evaluations that are mandated by law, administration, and boards of trustees that distract us from our primary work and exhaust us in the life of the mind. It's going to ask us to be attentive to how the neoliberal university restructures labor through an expansion and dependence on non-unionized adjunct and contingent labor, through valorizing areas of the university that are, quote, applied or more interesting to a donor class, to spaces of hierarchy that we're caught up within, and to students who are constructed as consumers, all of which requires resistance. I was listening to another virtual event recently, and Barbara Ransby said, we will have to resist the language, the logics, and knowledges of neoliberal universities and coloniality. And I hear you, that's a lot of undoing, but I do think it's necessary. And I think we have strategies in another discussion, Robin Kelly, who I think is really doing some important work in this moment, says, don't let our hunger for resources move us away from structural demands, like abolition. Don't concede larger demands, like moving policing off campus and shaping the security and the safety we want in our communities. Don't do that. Don't concede to those larger demands to things like more faculty lines or fellowships. And that's just a tried and true strategy, right? That can divide us. Rather, really focus on things like zero tuition and debt. In fact, divest from police and other kinds of policing functions and provide free tuition. That's a particular, that's in the US, these are especially important for us with the debt peonage system we've created through education. So alongside of that, I think is another question for us that we can ask at this structural level, which is, are the efforts that we're calling for and we're engaged in, are they going to change the current structure? Or are they minimally going to shake it up? I know we can't change everything within these kinds of institutions, or do they expand the institution itself? And I think that's bound up with the fundamental premise here, which is, I think, as many of us in the Zoom know, campuses are not safe. And part of the reason they're not safe is because of police. We routinely have students in our offices who do not wish to report the kinds of violence, especially sexual violence, that they're experiencing across campus. And thinking about that asks us, well, if we're not safe, why are we not safe? And it's not just cops on campus, because policing as a function extends much larger. It includes university administration and regulatory powers. It includes boards of governors and trustees. who've had dramatic shaping power in institutions in the US. And it also involves kind of thinking through a political economy of divestment. Universities are realtors, developers, gentrifiers, tax shelters, and major employers for entire towns and communities that they do little to nothing for outside of displacement, extraction, and building up the carceral state. So I think coming back to decolonization, which I'm eager to hear more about today, there's real tangible demands related to land, related to autonomy, and related to existence. We're foundationally tied with universities to a political economy of low-wage workers who accumulate wealth and have historically off the backs of largely BIPOC students in our communities, athletes, and community workers. So I want to think about those things with you because I think those are the kinds of questions that are going to push us to think specifically about how our organizing has to extend outside of our academic appointments and institutions. Ransby again has stated, insurgent intellectual work has to be done in service to a movement. And that we're not going to win without that kind of organizing and thinking that through. So part of what I think we're really being asked to do is what abolition always asks us to do, which is to rethink everything and specifically our relationships to each other, how knowledge production takes place in communities that are in struggle. For criminologists, which I'm going to turn to here quickly, rethinking the space in which we do the work and who the knowledge producers are and have been. And then moving forward towards something that asks us to really challenge the notion of the university as an abolition project and an education carceral nexus. I'm thinking here of Eli Meyerhoff's book on Beyond Education, where he tells us, that we should be thinking in other kinds of terms around freedom universities that will bring community partnerships, not in the sense that we often think of it, but in organizing and asking the questions in the work that we do. And one thing I would point to is, for me, these are actually research questions we should be posing in the classroom with our students and doing that work on. Like, we need the actual empirical knowledge, the empirical data around this so that we can use it in these arguments and fights. Okay, so criminology, what does that mean? Well, for someone like me, who's trained in this discipline, that I view very clearly as the key site for the weaponization of academia to defend the carceral, right? In all kinds of ways, ranging from epistemic violence to how it's grounded in physical violence. We are one of the key sites for producing, as are many others, but racialized and gendered knowledge production that leads to the carceral state. We're a carceral training site. So I'm sure it's not news to most of you that two of the police officers charged with aiding and abetting in the murder of George Floyd were students in the sociology department at the University of Minnesota. And we all have amazing colleagues in that department that are well respected. But I encourage you to seek out Amber Hamilton, who's a grad student there, and a lot of what she had to say about this in terms of ending active recruitment and marketing to law enforcement, criminology and sociology and law programs. So it's a struggle, I think, even as I ground myself in criminology's radical and critical traditions, it's still a struggle to figure out what that role is. Because criminology itself has been so involved as a prosthetic of the state in terms of the exercise of police power and carceral power. And I'm not sure, in terms of, I'm not interested in salvaging those projects. I'm interested in taking what we know that is useful and moving forward in what leads us in other directions. And to me, I do think that means all the things. It means rethinking departments and program names and ending the student to prison industrial complex employment line, rethinking curricula, syllabi, job fairs, our internships, who we invite as guest lecturers. And the transformation of our research in ways that center movement-based knowledges, that focus on learning how to be non-extractive, that engage what participatory work means with communities, and breaking down the walls that divide us from the very people we should be thinking through these problems with, to provide our students a chance to become organizers rather than cops, and to find a way to do this without further exhausting our BIPOC students and faculty who have been pointing in this direction. So that, to me, part of what I'm trying to think through is how to be braver in all of these aspects in ways that will help us redefine our relationships and ask, what are our relationships as programs where we're localized? And I think this means a lot of similar things for criminology and criminal justice program schools, colleges, and sociology, anthropology, political science, but it also means very specific things for where we are literally how we're located regionally in all of this, and how we situate ourselves into an analysis of systemic racism, state violence, and violence work that's imbricated in everything we were talking about today: racial capitalism, neoliberalism, austerity. So part of that means building and committing to disarmed and demilitarized workplaces and learning places, of course. But it also points us to coalition building, particularly with our students. These are youth-led movements. I think they've looked to us and instead have had to go elsewhere for that kind of an education, which further exhausts them. And I think about this in the work, for instance, how I think about someone like Amna Akbar, whose work is bringing social movement work into law schools. So we're reimagining law. And this is someone, Amna knows very clearly how this work can be co-opted, but working within the spaces we are in by trying to bring other relationships to it and moving ourselves into other kinds of spaces simultaneously. So I think we live in a kind of fear of centering social justice, and social justice, whatever that means, right? It can mean too many things, but even more significantly, movement work and organizing as streams of meaningful work and labor. And addressing that is really important for criminology, in part because of where we come from and what we do. So I think this is another kind of reality check for us. I was listening to someone else recently, Kathy Cohen, of course, a political scientist at University of Chicago, who's very interested in, the fully imaginative world of abolition, but also points to how much data we have that says people are not ready to fully defund the police. Minneapolis is kind of in this real controversial space right now with that, as people are drawing back from defunding. But I think that's precisely where the work of education and the work of criminology can step in to create the conditions in which people can imagine, people can begin to think about what reimagining public safety looks like. So providing questions and prompts that move us beyond the singularity of police and the carceral state as institutions. And I think that means for criminologists, we really have to think about the labor force that we've created. I live in a part of the world in which students come because their parents have lost jobs in factories, mines, plants. And the one thing that they are constantly bombarded with is the idea of bleak futures and prospects. And there are prisons in their town that are hiring them. And there are, law enforcement. And we know that this has changed the US workforce with more carceral and violence workers than there are teachers, primary physicians, social workers, et cetera. And doesn't it show in this moment? So the idea that we have a culture of guards that we've been creating who are then designated to surveil surplus populations is precisely the sign that capitalism is trying to save itself by eating itself. The transformation of work is something that we have to think about in futures that can only be perceived as carceral. So I'm particularly committed to that in terms of constantly having first generation students who comes from generations of both military service and law enforcement service, and trying to think, what are the conditions that produce the possibility for them, as my colleague and friend Judah Shept is writing in his forthcoming book, that bring them to arrive at police and prisons. I'm also thinking of a recent quote from Ruthie Gilmore where she says, I am not against any person's income, and saying defund the police does not mean taking the means to pay for life and have a living. It means keep your income, but do other things with your time. So there is an unbecoming that has to happen with policing and violence work. I want to kind of reiterate, I'm using violence work intentionally out of critical policing studies, because what we're really talking about is how we produce violence work and violence workers, well beyond the police, but functions of policing and imprisonment and the carceral that extend beyond this, which I think means really thinking about the transformation of a workforce that can be at least partially done through a project of education that also involves labor and labor organizing, and thinking through the ways we build multiracial coalitions around these issues, through pointing to both the issues around how we construct safety and the issues of how we construct work. And I will admit this means coming up against an institutional desire for violence. And we have to think about, well, where are the spaces in which people push back, as we see here in the US and a variety of other places, because they have quite literally an ideological desire that demands state violence. Well, these are attachments that we really have to work through in other kinds of ways as well, in terms of pointing to the fact that there are legacies imbued with white supremacy, legacies imbued with privilege and whiteness structurally, and that they're also jurispathic. And here I'm thinking of Robert Covered, that we should fully expect that whenever we lay out alternatives, there's going to be an overwhelming attack on those ideas to kill those ideas and possibilities in a kind of counterinsurgent space that we're caught up in. So that's a lot of what I've been thinking about. I'm also thinking about the way in which kind of revalorized forms of white supremacy, patriarchy, and masculinity converged in a centrality of men and boys in the production of this, as well as women who are kind of co-opted into these institutions, and what it'll look like to move people out of those places where there's this popular way of viewing oneself as maligned, misunderstood through some sort of white grievance. And then also moving into these other kinds of spaces that will necessarily be working with some of those folks simultaneously. They're there, they're in our classrooms, right? So what does that mean in terms of thinking through this? For me, that means really thinking about the sites, the formations, the politics that allow us to have conversations about how we move forward, how we envision and how we re-envision all of this in terms of building accountability in multiple kinds of spaces and building coalitions. And let me just add, right, I just lived through this past summer with you here in the US, and what we're living through across the next 27 days, because we are counting them down up to the election, and it's incredible. So I take quite seriously the moment of emergency as emergence and opportunity, and that's part of what I've learned through abolition. But I also take seriously there are other possibilities with that. The stakes are incredibly high. So thank you all, and now I get to sit back and learn more from Pamela. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Michelle. I mean, you know, it's a good panel when both of the panelists are like, oh, I can't wait to hear the other person speak. It's as much for us as anybody else. I really appreciate that. And I love that everything you said, I can just say ditto and then focus on other things, because honestly, like the way you frame these things, I think it's really important for people to understand, you know, do universities want to be involved in violence work, in violence training, in violence mentality, in violence philosophy? Like, and I have never really thought about it that way, but that's exactly what it is. So thank you to everyone. I'm going to set my timer because I can be very long-winded. Kwe Nindaluizi Pam Palmater. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation on unceded Mi'kma'ki, but today I'm coming from sovereign Mississaugas of Scugog territory. And thank you so much for including me in this and for including an Indigenous woman's voice and one who's very critical. So, but critical with a purpose, critical with a social justice purpose, an earth justice purpose, a people purpose. And, you know, this whole conversation about the role of governments and universities and agencies and society in everything that's going on, because with every vote, you support the system. With every tax dollar, you're paying for the system. And in fact, it ends up that we end up paying for our own oppression. We end up paying for social injustice. And I think we need to look at it, not just always looking at governments, but what are the other people, what are the other segments of society and agencies that are involved? And universities are one of those places. I'm a lawyer, you know, and I work in a university that has a huge criminology department, like many other universities. And, you know, law schools and criminology are very much the focus of this, you know, focus on the carceral state, and in some, you know, universities very much promoting of police and police violence and police lectures and police, you know, partnerships. And it's quite disturbing. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the underpinnings of this whole carceral state that we're in, because, you know, I take every opportunity to educate, because not everybody that's going to watch this knows all of the history and the insidious ways in which this is all tied together. And we know that for Indigenous peoples, our story starts long before the carceral state. I mean, we were powerful, sovereign, indigenous nations with our own sophisticated governments, political systems, legal regimes, trading networks. We had our own well-trained militaries. We defended our territories. We had, cultural traditions. And so our story is, from time immemorial, it's really a disservice to both Indigenous peoples and the public to start the story at, well, let's start with the incarceration of Indigenous peoples in a criminology class. And even me, I don't teach in criminology. I teach, Indigenous politics and government or Indigenous laws, but the questions are almost always incarceration related or police related or criminality related, and that's the focus of many students come to this only seeing Indigenous peoples in a criminalized context and not even understanding that there could be and has been and is so much more than that, or they only see it as, if there is a problem at all, the big if, it's just the police. And if you do a little finessing or give them some cultural awareness training, everything's going to be good. And I have no bigger pet peeve than cultural awareness training for police, because the problem has never been our culture. The problem is police culture. It's this whole ideology of criminalizing Indigenous peoples. And where does that come from? Because people think that, well, maybe it's just a few bad apples or the system is broken. But in fact, that's the complete opposite of what it is. The system was designed this way with very specific intention. It didn't even just evolve this way. Think about what Indian policy in Canada and the US means. What's Canada and the US now? We know from the record that Indian policy was always about acquiring native lands and resources and our lucrative trade routes and reducing financial obligations. And they only had two methods of doing that: assimilation or elimination. The objective of so-called Indian policy was always to clear the lands. And what has resulted? Well, we know here in Canada, Canada's been found guilty of genocide from the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls because of its purposeful engagement in the assimilation and the elimination of people. So smallpox, blankets, scalping bounties, mass murders of specific groups, ethnic cleansing on the prairies, massive deaths in residential schools that were considered by their own lawyers to be manslaughter. So, we know all of that. But the tendency even in many universities is to historicize that, as in, that was long ago, we're sorry, let's have some reconciliation and an apology and move on. When in fact, the most important part of that National Inquiry report was that the genocide is ongoing. It's the policies have been, characterized under a different way. They put lots of flowery language on it, but it's still the same thing. We still have deaths in police custody. We still have mass incarceration. The police fail to protect Indigenous women and girls from things like human trafficking or known killers. So, not only are they not doing their job, they're doing their job in a way that achieves the ends of genocide. You've got the mass institutionalization of Indigenous peoples across all specters. You've got forced and coerced sterilizations, child apprehensions, over incarceration. And what's at the heart of that? So it's one thing for government to have an Indian policy that's just like clear the lands from the Indians so we can have their lands and resources. And it's quite another for the government to do that. How do they do that? Well, they have genocide enforcers, and they're called the police. They're literally created that way in Canada to clear the land of the Indians and keep them, surveil them, monitor them, incarcerate them when needed, institutionalize them and their children. And they have literally been at the heart of it. Police and the carceral state are like literally genocide enforcers. So, and most people hopefully by now know what that is, that the RCMP took the lead role in the violent removal of Indigenous peoples from our lands. They were involved in the theft of Native children to go into residential schools. And if you ran away, it was the police that went and brought you back, yet they failed to act on the abuses. We know that they illegally prevented Native peoples from leaving reserves and created this kind of pass system, which they knew from their own lawyers was against the law and breached treaties. So this was never about lawfulness and abiding by laws or this so-called fictional rule of law. This was always about achieving the Indian policy ends: clear the lands of Native peoples, take the lands and resources. And that's why the police have been so involved in both the criminalization and the prevention of us from engaging in our traditional activities. Things like hunting, fishing, gathering, and trade. I mean, all of that has been criminalized, it's been highly regulated, and they're the first people to show up when there's a dispute. I mean, just look at what's happening in Mi'kmaq now. You know, you've got tons and tons of people trying to prevent Mi'kmaq people from fishing, which we have a legal right to do. You look at in Wet'suwet'en territory, peacefully occupying their territory, violently removed by the RCMP. What's happening in 1492 Land Back Lane? You've got the OPP, you know, arresting people for occupying what is their territory. So you've got this, you know, carceral state with genocide enforcers that do the bidding. And the bidding is to surveil, monitor, count, track, report, oppress, and incarcerate. Literally just keep removing Native peoples from the lands. And so you've got the history of it. They're the enforcers of it today, and they are now the primary pipeline from our lands to institutionalization. Whether it's involuntary hospitalization, institutionalization in mental institutes, in youth corrections, in youth group homes, and in prisons and jails. I mean, the police are the primary feeder group. And especially when the police have so much discretion over whether or not they can charge people. And so how does that manifest today? People keep trying to look towards the bad apple scenario because then they can preserve the status quo. But it's the whole status quo that is the problem. And it's resulted in high kill rates by police of Indigenous peoples. That should be no surprise. None of that's an accident. I mean, you've got countless outside organizations, media institutes, and researchers doing research showing that, you know, over a 17-year period, police forces of all kinds in Canada killed Indigenous peoples at exceptionally high rates, at more than 16%, but they're only, you know, 4 to 5% of the population. But, you know, in specific regions where lands and resources are highly contested, like in the province of Manitoba, that's 58% of all police killings are Indigenous. And in Saskatchewan, 63%. So you just only need to look where lands and resources are key issues, and you have high kill rates of Indigenous peoples by all different police forces, but also super high incarceration rates. I mean, it follows wherever there is huge conflict over lands and resources, high kill rates, high incarceration rates. I mean, in federal prisons right now, more than 30% are Indigenous, but Indigenous women who are on the front lines of leading the resistance are now 42% of the federal incarceration rates. And Indigenous youth, who we know for many years that the RCMP have long considered, you know, this impending danger for national security in Canada. Well, it should be no surprise that Indigenous youth are more than 50%, and Indigenous girls in particular can be as high as 98% of those who are incarcerated in youth corrections. And we all know statistically where that pipeline goes. You know, foster care leads to youth corrections leads to prison leads to poverty and violence and murdered and missing and all of those things. So the police know that. I mean, it's not like we're in a situation where, you know what, I think we need to do another study about what's happening. Is there systemic racism? Is there a pipeline? They've known it. They can actually manipulate it with a high degree of precision based on just even minor adjustments in their policy, their funding, their laws, how all of these things are enforced, and they have been doing it for decades. So for anyone to think that the system is broken, oh my goodness, it's working exactly how they want it to be. And the fact that it's been studied and studied and studied. Every time society starts to, reject all of this, reject this carceral, racist, genocidal state, well, then the solution is always, well, let's have a royal commission or a public inquiry or a study. And then that just buys everybody time, and everyone sits back and says, okay, great, the government's doing its job. But it's not doing its job, first of all. And second of all, that presumes that the government is the only culpable party here, that police forces aren't their own agencies. And they are. They have wicked powerful police unions. They have exceptionally high degrees of impunity. These are the kinds of things that we have been contesting for a long time, because we know they kill with a high degree of impunity. They engage in widespread acts of sexualized violence and exploitation. They're engaged themselves in human trafficking and child porn rings and sexualized violence against Indigenous women and girls. Where's the action on it? There is no action on it. And in fact, we had a national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls that looked at the high rates of violence and sexualized violence. And guess which group we weren't allowed to study? The police. So knocked out of the terms of reference. You couldn't even look at them. And that's, we have to look at this when we're looking at this carceral state. There are some segments of society, some government organizations and universities where we're allowed to look at. We're allowed to take the research eye, we're allowed to take the critical eye. But the one we haven't been is police. And even though we had protests and even though we had these movements, we have to look at where are we now? Weeks or months after all of this happened, where are we now? Has there been any real movement by any government to in any way adjust where policing is, how they're being governed, what the relationship is, and the inappropriate relationships are between the really powerful and wealthy police unions, politics, the state, and the extractive industry? Because that's the other thing. Think about, since the very first creation of the Northwest Mounted Police and then the RCMP and other police forces, they weren't just engaged with Indian agents in terms of keeping them on reserve, keeping them out of resistance, and all of the things I mentioned earlier. They always maintained their mission of surveillance, monitoring, counting, tracking, and incarcerating to achieve the colonial ends. And they're engaged in that in widespread measures today. I mean, we know from lots of research, we know from access to information requests, we know from amazing books that have been written by Jeffrey Monahan and others, that the state literally polices Indigenous identity, our culture, our bodies, and our lands in every way, and even our peaceful movements. I mean, peaceful murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls vigils. I mean, candlelight ceremonies are on the lists of these hotspot groups to monitor and surveil and breach all of our privacy rights. So we're all quite aware of that. And it's one of the reasons why we are so opposed to things like anti-terrorism legislation that focuses, internally. I mean, Canada has this horrendous anti-terrorism legislation, which even more criminalizes things like advocacy, engaging in, international advocacy, engaging in things like possible interference with pipelines, with mines. All of these things have been prioritized. The extractive industry has been prioritized, but it's so much worse than that. And here's the part that universities, I don't really see grasping with in the content that they're teaching their students. It's this really inappropriate relationship, not just between police and police unions with political groups and governments, for example, but also with the extractive industry, as if that industry itself is its own form of government with its own interests. And it's something that governments and political parties of all backgrounds have allowed to develop over time. So you have a scenario in Canada where the RCMP shares this, you know, surveillance of Indigenous peoples, this information about who's involved, where they're involved, what their risks are with the extractive industry. So third parties that aren't governments and in conjunction with governments, but you don't see any sharing of the threat or risk of these extractive industries and who's involved and where they are with Indigenous peoples, which you would expect if Canada was really built on a system of the rule of law. And we know that they're not built on a system of the rule of law. This is the law of rulers and what the rulers want. And it's all based on Indian policy, clearing the lands, accessing the lands and resources, and getting as much slave labor as possible. And that's literally where we are. We're in this carceral state that's working very well. It's working very efficiently. It creates lots of jobs. I mean, most municipalities are quite happy to see prisons being constructed because of the jobs, because of the training, because of all of these things, just like Michelle was talking about. And so if we don't look at all of these really complex interrelationships between, you know, police and police unions, the carceral state, prisons and corrections officers and the people who run these prisons and jails, and ultimately what Indian policy is all about, which is acquiring lands and resources and clearing the lands of Indigenous peoples by whatever means possible. And really saying that if to get beyond all of that, whether it's at the university level, government, or societal level, you have to look at the underlying core policy. Otherwise, it'll always adjust back to itself. That's why we've been trapped in this, I don't even know what to call it, in this grand deception of social change through legislative amendments, in social change through diversity training, in social change through tweaking everything around the edges instead of getting at the heart of what the problem is. And if you want to look at it, we're talking about a system here in Canada and the US that was created on a system of white supremacy, and which not only privileges those, you know, European ideologies and objectives, it also punishes those who don't fit that way. And it's not because they're of different cultures, and it's not because of any kind of cultural differences. That's really a myth. The reason why there's this superiority, inferiority, complex, and punishment system is for economic purposes. It's for power and it's for wealth. That's why the carceral state and police have always focused so much on dispossessing Native people of their lands and resources, and monitoring Black people during the slavery period, to monitor all of their actions, where they could go, where they couldn't go, because they were the source of the slave labor. And what has changed? What has changed? I mean, we're still the targets of all of this. And I know I'm at my 20 minutes, but I just really want to reinforce to, you know, governments and universities that we shouldn't be in a constant repetitive state of studying. Let's study the statistics. Oh, look, the incarceration rates are worse again this year. Oh, look, more murdered and missing. Oh, look, more police killings. And we're just in a constant state of studying instead of deconstructing and, you know, everything that Michelle said in her whole lecture or her whole talk about really confronting all of it. What is education? Education's purpose is not just for information's sake. Education is about, you know, individual and collective well-being. It's about societal well-being. It's about creating these, you know, societies that work, that are good for everybody. And if we're teaching, you know, reinforcing the carceral state and violence and racism and genocide, so long as it's for economic purposes, then we're perpetuating a society that won't be here. I mean, climate change will ensure that we're not here. And we don't even have time to think about this, pontificate about it, and talk about the, you know, philosophy of it. We're in a crisis. And that's why we need to, as Michelle said, really put social movement education forward. I mean, these people are educating us, and they have They have so many solutions. We've come up with solutions, and we should be moving that way. And any government around the world that isn't focused on land back to Indigenous peoples, recognizing autonomy, addressing climate change, and focusing on societal well-being, that is, doesn't have at the core power and wealth, then we're condemning ourselves. And I think universities really need to think about that we have to get at the heart. We have to look at the policies and why it's not changing. Amendments aren't going to do it. There's no amendment anyone is going to present and say, yep, that's going to deal with all of this large, huge, complex issue. We have to actually go right to the bottom and change what our policy and objectives are. And it definitely shouldn't be genocidal clearing of the lands of Indigenous peoples.
Amazing. Yes. Yeah, this is, I mean, thank you so much. I'm in awe of both of you. And obviously, I know that we probably have a lot of things that we want to say in conversation with one another. Both of you have provided obviously extremely brilliant insights for those of us, participating in this. And, I don't know, where would you like to begin? I'm actually just wondering if Michelle and Pamela have any comments, to one another they want to start with, or we'd like to open it up to, the floor for questions. I have a few. I know that there are a couple, there are others that are being posted. How would you guys like to begin?
I'm good with questions, especially if people have questions.
Sure.
What do you think, Michelle?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, that's great. Kirsten Anderson, pronouns she, her, has asked the following. I'm just going to read it if that's okay. Dr. Brown listed several actions for university faculty, staff, and administrators to help move towards ending the school to prison pipeline, such as changing syllabi, carefully selecting guest speakers, etc. And Dr. Palmater discussed how we need to stop doing research that for the information that's already there. So what can university students do now and continue to do after university to support the movement towards changing the university and society towards decolonization, anti-racism, and abolitionism? Yeah.
Do you want to go ahead, Michelle? Okay. I really appreciate when students ask this question, because students actually have more power than they think they do. I mean, if you look at the way most universities are constructed, students sit on policy program reviews, students offer reviews every year, students there's lots of different venues in which students have a direct line into what's good about a program, what's not good about a program. And that's just within that institutional context. And they could be saying, no, we don't want this anymore. You need to completely rethink, the law school. You need to completely rethink criminology. You need to completely rethink, your research partnerships and who you're bringing here. And so even within the institutional part, students can have a huge say. And what really is sad is when I sit on some of these committees and we look to see if there was any student input on, what we're teaching in our grad studies, for example, and there isn't. It's a real missed opportunity. And I'm sure that largely lays at the fault of universities for not making it easier and, to purposely reach out to students. But there's just so many missed opportunities for students to say no. And that's just within the institution. Outside of the institution, the sky is literally the limit in terms of engaging in social movements and helping to share the knowledge and working to bolster these social movements. I mean, I don't need to tell students that, but just don't forget about all the ways in which you can direct. You're paying for it. So you should be telling the university, yeah, we don't support fossil fuels. We don't support the carceral state either. So let's divest from that business.
Yeah, I would echo all of that and add, I think one of the points that I really liked coming out of Pamela's talk is this issue around research, right? And the way I understood that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pamela, is that it's the kind of research we already know everything about, right? I mean, it's the kind of research that constantly reiterates like the miseries of the carceral state, as opposed to the interventions, right? And the social movement research that we could bring in. And that's part of what I would point to here, is that we have a lot of questions to be asking. We still have a lot of things to be doing as students and researchers together, and also with, coming back to kind of my point, with the community, right? So trying to figure out with the communities who are doing this kind of work, what our roles are or can be in connection with them and in connection with supporting the movement. So part of what I would say you're doing is you're shifting from a consumer identity as a student to a very critical actor with political will. And that's not easy to do. I mean, we're not constituted within the university to do that, really, in neoliberal university. So trying to shift back to this idea that Pamela's saying, if you've got a lot of power, youth movements have the power. They've historically been how we've shifted these, movements. So building that as a kind of a study that's different than the kind of study we've had too much of, that reifies and reproduces the carceral state. The kind of study, the kind of work that's engaged and on the ground and with communities that will actually move towards this kind of decolonization, anti-racism. It's a kind of, for me, it's the possibility to build a political will that goes on across your lifetime, shapes how you pursue work, what you demand of the institutions you work within, because we're never really going to be caught within institutions, and also how we build a future in a moment that is trying to foreclose every possible future, right? I mean, the question of futurity is so important in all of this. I take Pamela's point very seriously when she says this kind of genocidal conquest is just in iterations that continue over and over and over. And people have existed through it. So we have got to find and think through the strategies and the ways with people who have done this kind of work to build futures. So that's part of what I would say.
Yeah, and I just wanted to reinforce what Michelle was saying about community. We also need to think about education outside of institutions. Like, what is education for? If we only think about it in this, liberal, everything is for me, it's my benefit, my whatever, then we miss all of the knowledge and the power that's already in communities, because communities are the ones that are leading these social movements. And imagine, continuing to put those two things together, where the power rests. I mean, the power has always rested with the people. The state has done a lot of work to oppress and suppress any idea that we have some kind of political power. But imagine putting those two things together in a really powerful way so that education is for everybody. If we only see it as the students before us, wow, we're in so much trouble and we're doing a disservice to society. And I think that's I really appreciate Michelle's point about don't forget the community. That's where these are the people that are most impacted. There's tons of knowledge there. There's tons of experience. It's not our first go around in these social movements. And so bringing those things together and making it a part, not just, oh, and by the way, I consulted with a community member, or, oh, by the way, I added them to my research project. Less researching, more movement and empowering and uplifting, I think. So I really appreciate that, Michelle.
If I could pick up on that and pull a couple of threads together and then sort of also connect it to one of the questions that we have here. So much going on. One thing that I'm thinking about here is that when, we do want to turn to our students are very politically minded and are actually, doing that work, community work, are forcing change from within the institution. We also have, when criminology cut its ties, decided not to create any more placements with policing agencies. We had students push back on that and say that this was actually a problem for them. And, part of the reason why we want to continue to have this conversation is to help our students understand where that decision comes from and, why this move is actually a broader move that is about more community-based sort of responses and sort of thinking through social justice in broader terms. And, both of you have mentioned, Pat, you mentioned police as genocidal enforcers. Michelle, you mentioned police as violence workers. And, I think in our conversations at the ICCJ, a lot of our students wanting to go into policing see themselves as social workers, or see themselves as a form of social worker, right? And so, this could be obviously a failure of education and how, we're educating about the institution and all that, and that sort of stuff. And so obviously, curriculum changes could be a big element of it. But what would maybe you say to the fact that, there has been student pushback, there's been beyond student pushback to the idea that the ICCJ is no longer going to have placements with policing and corrections agencies, that, we are preventing potentially the possibility of affecting change from within, which I think you both spoke to quite eloquently about this idea that we can just tinker with the existing systems and that have, affect the change we need. But I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
You want to go first, Michelle?
Sure, I'll jump in. I mean, I have these conversations. I mean, I think first off, that's to be expected, right? It's to be anticipated that when we make these kinds of changes, this is exactly what's going to happen. And that therefore is an opening for a very difficult and challenging conversation. And that makes it a learning moment. So I do think that's critical. And I think we have ample ways to communicate why we would have those commitments, right? And that's bound up with all the things that Pamela just laid out in terms of the foundations of policing. What is policing? What is policing's functions and effects? And that comes back fully circling around to, if you're really interested, and I take seriously that there's a notion of service, of something like social work and social commitments, that people want to create change, as someone mentioned in the chat, that draws them to this in some ways. But the fact is, this institution has never done that. So, and we know that, and we actually have evidence. Again, we have that research. We know what it does. So if it's not doing that, then we really have to think seriously with our students about the attraction to that work and what other kinds of work would look like. And so for me, it really comes back to, again, the kinds of prompts that communities that have been directly impacted have moved us toward, as well as organizers, which is, what is safety? What is accountability? What really gets at the root conditions of violence? And how do you as an individual think you're going to change an institution that is a historical force built around one thing: use of violence? The one thing that defines police is that in any single situation which can possibly arise, they have the prerogative to use violence. And it's lawful, going back to law. And that's what provides all the immunity around everything that we're seeing. So it's not about, and I think we tell students this all the time, it's not about individuals, it's not about police officers, it's not about bad apples, it's about an institution. So to me, that is, again, a project of education that revolves around understanding things not in non-individuating discourses, but in collective, structural, and institutional forms, which everyone struggles with, particularly in the US, where we have such a deeply individualistic culture. But the other thing is, you're going to do that work for a while, and it's not going to be satisfying anyway, right? I mean, that's part of it. And if when I think about policing as a function, I really try and get students as well to think through all the ways the policing function extends beyond the police as an institution. As a professor, I'm often in a policing function, right? In my own conduct and what I'm required to do. So we need to be thinking in dramatic terms about that. But with our students, we've got to be prepared to point them to other ways to reinvent and reimagine spaces of meaningful work. So I guess, to me, I expect that pushback. That's part of exactly what this struggle is going to be about. And we need to be ready, and things like this, events like this, help us start to think about what that would mean to really be clear about on the ground with people who are attracted to this work.
I agree with literally everything that Michelle said, especially when you think about the status quo, right? The status quo it consistently reinforces itself. So any little tinkering around the edges, it always adjusts and finds a way to come back to the center. It's like, okay, how do we deal with police? It's because there's no body cams. Well, let's give millions more dollars to police so that so we can see what's happening. But the status quo will always adjust back and say, oh, now you have to pay to get access to those cameras. Oh, now there's privacy laws. You can't really access those It's within the union rights. You can't ask police officers to share what they were doing. So it will tinkering in the safe, friendly, easy, soft, not too painful way, just all it does is reinforce the status quo. Any substantive change is going to be, by its very nature, uncomfortable and painful. That's called social conflict. But social conflict is actually hopeful. It's when there is no social conflict, there are no movements, that we should be the most terrified, because that means everything is going to keep going, everything keeps getting worse, and no one cares. We know when we see social conflict that we're on the brink of change for good. And think about, how did we ever get women's rights, civil rights, Indigenous rights? We had to fight for it. We had to go through painful periods of conflict to get there. And I'm not saying that, the rights thing is where to go. But what I'm saying is you have to fight for change, and no change comes with a unanimous. You cannot wait until there is consensus and everyone feels good about it, or we would be back where women didn't even have a voice. I mean, if we waited for men to say, you know what, we're good with women voting, we wouldn't have women voting. And so we have to embrace the conflict that comes with it, and universities and governments and other societal institutions have to just get comfortable with the discomfort that, yeah, some students are going to be upset, some parents will be upset, there might even be protests. But human rights are not a popularity contest. You always have to do what is right, and this is about saving lives, not just in terms of the lifespan, but the quality of people's lives and whether we have a life in the future. And that means we have to embrace it, because if you look at it in an Indigenous context, if Indigenous reconciliation is going to be about celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day and putting some Native artwork up on university campuses, man, we're screwed. It's got to be about land back, recognition of autonomy. It's got to be about changing everything. And that's the part that scares people. But it's up to us to lead that change. People will follow when they see the good that comes from it. But that's never going to happen unless you take that painful step of leading the change that lots of people won't like.
Thank you. Yes, agreed. And I think that this leads really well to another question that was asked, actually, about, we have our university right now, the institution with the inclusion reports, committees, all of these sort of movements that are happening right now, the tweaking at the edges, Pat, as you talked about it, that, sorry, Pam, as you mentioned it, the question comes from Pat. All of these sort of reports, inclusion, diversity, changes that are happening at the university level, even at the departmental level, are also going to the board of governors, right? And they're also going to university structures that are, they're the ones that are ultimately going to be making the bigger decisions on what happens here. I mean, do we see opportunities for bigger structural change in the university, given the governance structure, given the funding model that we have right now? I mean, there's another question here that talks very purposefully about the fact that, do universities purposefully obscure how they're funded and how they're run to further their own agendas? I mean, at the structural level, oftentimes it doesn't get constructed as a decarceral or a decolonial sort of effort that way. But what other sort of things would you like to see us doing at the university to push back at governance and make sure that we're actually furthering the decolonial and the critical race project through governance structures and funding models?
Do you want to go ahead, Michelle? No. Okay, so this is another bee in my bonnet that I have. I work with different universities talking about things, especially around reconciliation, how to quote unquote indigenize universities. I also hate that word too. And I would say anecdotally about 90% of the suggestions are all things that we are mandated to do by law anyway. It is against the law to discriminate. It is against the law to not represent people in society in terms of research and who you hire and who occupies leadership positions. All of these things, you don't get to pat yourself on the back and say, you know what, we're going to stop acting in a racially discriminatory way and hire more Native people. Yeah, you should have been doing that all along. Or I'm going to create an advisory committee where Native staff and faculty get to provide input to the university. Yeah, you should have been doing that all along. So all of this stuff, going from violating the law to complying with the law, none of that gets to count. So then take all of that from your university plan, and what are you doing that's different? What are you doing that's a substantive, painful change? And I say painful because it's painful because people don't want to give up power and wealth. Have you created a space, a meaningful decision-making space for local First Nations to have a say in what gets taught at your university, and not just in Native studies, but across the board, you know? So not just women only get to talk about what's happening in child and family services. Women only get to talk about what's happening in early childhood education. No, meaningful and decision-making governance has to be included in how universities are run. And I guarantee you, you wouldn't see conferences supported by Trans Mountain Pipeline and for social justice. You know, you just wouldn't see that. And you wouldn't see hydro companies supporting student sponsors when that hydro company is actually in litigation with the local First Nation. How can you profess to have a relationship with your local First Nations, or say you're in the North with Inuit, if you're in bed with the people that are incarcerating them, arresting them, suing them, and dispossessing them? It depends. What kind of university do you want to be? Do you just want to promote the genocide that's ongoing and the social injustice and the climate destruction? Because that's a choice. Or do you want to be something different and take all of those really brave, unique, not been done, you can't find it at any other university approach to moving forward? And you'll always be able to find individuals in the community that will support what you're doing, the tweaking around the edges, because people want to be helpful. They want to be supportive. They want you to think that you're doing good too. But I think you need to seek out those who say that's not good enough. I think you need to have the people around the table with highly critical voices, as well as the ones who are saying, no, what you're doing is good.
Right again, like I echo all of that. And I would just add that to me, I think part of how we get to those kinds of meaningful decision-making spaces, right? Part of how we have to think about that is through, again, a kind of organizing. So not only are Black and Indigenous and queer voices missing in all of this, faculty and student voices are missing in all of this. So here's, again, a coalitional moment, right? Staff voices are missing in all of this. So who has, to go back to Kristen's question, who has the control over this? Who is making the decisions? And why are absolutely none of us represented in that? And if that's the case, that's again an organizing point to push back on until we do. And here, I mean, in Tennessee, not only do we not have voices at those levels, whether it's administration and our board of trustees, which is a really challenging space, but it goes straight to the legislature, which has, you know, we have an ongoing battle with our state legislature here, which systematically every term wants to restrict everything that we're trying to do in terms of social justice. So it's a very active battleground. But in that space, you know, just to point to one way in which we've had a win, we do have a union for campus workers, and that we were able to organize and push back against privatization, and we actually won that battle. They did not privatize all of our staff and services on campus. We were able to keep it here. But it took organizing, again, with all of us to find and fight for these spaces. So the advocacy is kind of unending. The only other way I would point to, because I think about this a lot, and we haven't been as brave as the ICCJ in some ways in our program. Instead, what we did is what Fred Moten, you know, basically argues is we stole the resources we had at the university in order to move away from a lot of these things. So we moved our internships gradually away from violence work. We built particular kinds of participatory research capstones. We've gradually built in an organizing track alongside of others others. And then eventually, like, the dean and other folks were like, well, you're doing something that other places aren't. And we're like, that's right. So stop asking us to do the work of the carceral state. And it became clear that that probably won't hold. We'll be in these battles again. But it's just ongoing work.
Absolutely, and there's still so much work that we at the Institute have to do, and we'll continue to, take inspiration from units such as your own. I have another question, because I see that there's some in progress here, but, you've both spoken quite eloquently about obviously extractive, industries and neoliberal governance, and obviously, racialized capital and the implications that sort of has for the university and how it's sort of structured and governed, but also how it sort of affects the so-called criminal justice system and its operations. And there's individualism has come up once or twice, but ultimately, if we're thinking about, dialing back on these neoliberal agendas, if we're thinking about dialing back on these, economic, racialized, carceral, racialized capitalist agendas, I think a big fear is that we live in a highly individualistic North American culture, unless, of course, Indigenous cultures are more relational, more communal, more community oriented in their sort of epistemological worldviews and their underpinnings. But I think one of the questions I keep hearing from my students is like, or even actually my colleagues, many of us who become more and more individualized and more uninterested in sort of seeing or talking to other people, is how do we sort of push back on this sort of individualism that we're, we all kind of many of us have internalized as just sort of a good and healthy way of being or existing in this world, but obviously is contrary to the sort of collectivist, community-oriented, broader picture initiatives that all of us are speaking to with respect to the university and sort of decarceral and decolonial agendas, right? Which take us away from our own interests and have us focus more broadly on the community. And this is a position that not a lot of people are interested in going in, or is uncomfortable for them, or like community doesn't really have a resonance for them. What would you say to that element of the bigger picture?
I'll take a dive here. It's what we deal with every single day, right? I mean, it's just foundational to the work that we're doing systematically, especially as educators. So, I'd usually try. I think part of it is starting where people are and asking how that's working out for them in terms of safety, or in terms of, and that's going to depend on who they are too, right? So there's kind of an intersectional analysis that comes out of that, and there's, in the course of a classroom, for instance, that becomes very visible in terms of the differences. But part of it too is simply saying, how we think about community, and I'm using it very loosely in this talk, I would like to be qualifying it at every step of the way, does involve thinking about your role and your contribution, which is not, I think the first thing that students often think is, well, I need to go in and help. And no, it's not extractive. It's not, you're learning, you're being a part of community. And that starts with your community. What's happening in your community? And if it's largely white middle class and in the suburbs and experience, how are you operating in these kinds of forces, and how are other people who are different from you experiencing that? So I know we do a lot of that work, and it sounds a little bit rote, but at the same time, I think that's how students have to learn that they're actually a part of something. Because at least in the US, I don't even know how people imagine community often, right? It's a very individualized, atomized space, especially right now. And so trying to bring people together around coalitional issues, which does include jobs and labor. And do you really want to do that kind of work Or would you rather actually be doing meaningful work that brings accountability and safety to us all? What would that look like? So again, I mean, right now, at least as an initial space for me in the classroom, I'm really starting with what does safety look like for you? And then going back out and saying, wow, you know, what would this involve? And we're right, today was our halfway point. And in my discussion boards, I was finally like, oh my gosh, they're actually starting to use some structural kinds of language. You know, it's taken us there. They'll leave the class and forget it, right? And go back out and be constituted. It's just endless work. And I don't like to keep saying that, but for me, the horizon of abolition is absolutely a horizon, and it's an endless kind of exhausting work. But to go back to Pamela's point, it's hopeful. And as Miriam Kaba says, hope is a discipline. So I think they want to find ways to do that. They have commitments to work that they want it to be meaningful, most of them. We have to like work through the seductions of violence work in order to get to the other part of it, which is what would change really look like. And that involves suddenly realizing, oh, collective capacities are better than me going out and changing the world.
Literally everything that Michelle said. And I'm also going to say, for everything that I'm saying, there's a whole bunch of provisos and conditions on it. You know, I'm just going to assume that we're all talking about the same thing here. But I think there's an additional dimension to this, that we can be both individual and collective. So for Indigenous peoples, many Indigenous peoples, because we all come from diverse nations, our concept of sovereignty is both individual and collective. We are sovereign as individuals. We can agree or not agree, participate or not participate as we choose without punishment in our nations, and vice versa. Our nations as the collective are sovereign together and have and it's a two-way street. It's always an ongoing responsibility. Supporting the collective sovereignty doesn't mean surrendering the individual sovereignty. It's a relationship, and you have to have both for it to work. And we don't have both. And I believe that we've been taught by the powers that be that the good is the individual, you all alone, and the bad is the collective because it's communist or socialist or some other evil. But it's the collective where the power is. It's the collective where the protection is. It's the collective where the, you know, thinking and ideologies and education comes from. Of course, they want us to think we're alone. One person alone, yeah, that's how abuses are allowed to happen. That's how the worst atrocities are allowed to happen. But we also need to, get away from this good and bad part of it, and get away from the fact that it has to be one or the other, and then start celebrating all the ways in which society operates collectively without even knowing it. You know, think about here in Canada, we, you know, the money that goes, taxpayers' money, I hate even calling it that, but the taxpayers' money in the stolen lands and resources goes to fund collective healthcare, collective education, collective social programs. And that's a form of community. Your community is in different ways. When you're in a university classroom, you're in a little community of people who are working towards similar goals. You're trying to learn. Sometimes you have study groups, you're studying together, you join social movements. Like we're human beings. We're genetically predisposed to be part of a collective. To teach us that we're all alone and that our rights are superior as individuals, or that we can even survive as an individual, is a falsehood. So I think we need to just start, you know, less about this oppositional. That's a fiction. Tell me what society operates by a whole bunch of individuals. I don't know of any. I'm sure you can find, you know, a hermit somewhere who lives all by him or herself, but ultimately human beings live as collectives, and we need to embrace and celebrate that, not vilify it, and then see the ways in which our non-action, our non-intentionality is hurting our collective, so that it's not just about what benefits me, but what it benefits everybody and how it impacts the collective. And I think it needs to be celebrated more in all the ways we don't even think about how we're acting as a collective. Even here, we're acting as a collective with a common purpose to educate and discuss and inspire and try to reach out and make, you know, connections and contribute to a movement which is for everybody. I don't think anybody is in the social justice or earth justice movement. And I mean, nowhere is this more relevant than, hello, earth justice, climate change. I mean, we are not just in a community in our local area, it's the planet. We either have a future or we don't, and not just for human beings, but for all plants and animals and life. And so it's really thinking about that community in a much larger way, in a positive way, because when we're individualized, boy, that's how they take all our power. And governments know, I mean, small collectives of people have been able to topple governments. That's how powerful people are. So we have the power to make all of the good changes that we want in a way that's good for everybody.
Yes, like I'm not good with the emojis, but I'd have the clap function happening at this point too. I had that option. Thank you so much. I mean, that was beautifully put for what was not an eloquently asked question. So I appreciate both of, those insights there. And I think we're running out of time. We have one question about, Carleton specific, having, BIPOC, LGBTQ plus member options for insight, but that's something that we as the folks at the Carleton can possibly respond to. Are there any final words that you'd like to have, to say before we end our collective gathering and learning experience with one another? And we're so honored, but any last words?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, just thank you for the opportunity to think with you all. And these are urgent questions for us where we are, and also in my head every day. And also, I just want to reiterate, though, that as challenging as things are, as difficult as things are, I believe, for instance, Robin Kelly, when he says, we in the US have entered our third Reconstruction, and that this is possibly, the most abolitionist moment since emancipation in the post-Reconstruction era, after the Civil War, and that it may even be stronger. I think a lot is happening, and that a reckoning that is long overdue and has been taking shape for centuries is here. And that makes things while everything's absolutely exhausting, it's absolutely exhilarating too. And I really believe this has been, one of the most important summers and years in my life as both an activist and a scholar. We've been on the ground, we've been doing work and doing everything. And I think that's part of what the moment necessarily requires of all of us, and that we can trust that wherever we are, how to move in those environments and build toward that. I think to trust the arc of that, even as we have lots of things at stake from our future at all to where the US will be in a month. So that's my final points. Thank you again, and especially to Pamela, who we should have just closed with your last statement.
Well, thank you for having me a part of this panel and for being able to learn from Michelle. I feel like, Michelle, I could just sit down and talk to you for days and days and days and days and days and just learn so much. And that's the whole benefit of a community. You get people who see it in just a little bit different way, or add another point, or add a nuance, or, because none of us know everything. And that's the beauty of this community. And, I would say embrace the conflict. I'm thankful every day when I see even a tiny protest, because it means that people still care and people still feel like change has to happen. And there's going to be lots of loud voices, the ones who stand to lose from, centuries of the wealth and power they gain from oppression and dispossession and marginalization. Yeah, of course, they have lots of money. They're going to look like they're more powerful than they are. Just remember that the people with the power and the wealth have the ability to put up what looks like an imposing front line, but they don't have a whole lot in their second line. We have lots. We're firm because we're standing on the side of what's ultimately justice, and justice looks different to different people, and that's okay. But we need to embrace the conflict, accept disruption, accept that some things have to be completely destroyed and rebuilt, and that it's change. It's fundamentally change, and it's coming, whether we want it or not. it's coming. Whether you want to be a part of it or not, it's coming. So how do we come together as all different kinds of multiple overlapping communities and make that happen so that we actually have a future? And that's what this is about. This is about a future. If we just think it's about policing, we're in trouble. Then we're just, you know, siloed, making amendments around the edges. And I think it's so much bigger than that. And I'm very thankful that there are some communities and some universities actually embracing this, embracing the difficulty, because it's good. It's good. It means change coming, and it's okay if it doesn't come this year, and it's okay if we don't see it 5 years from now, or that this social movement isn't the one that does it, because one of them will. Each social movement is a seed that inspires the next, and it'll be the one that ultimately inspires the final change. We just have to embrace it as it comes, so never lose hope.
Thank you so much to you, Pam and Michelle, for those amazing words and information, for sharing your time and your energy and your brilliance with us. Thank you so much for your ongoing research and your activism. We look forward to co-conspiring with you and moving the university and the world forward towards social justice. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And, you know, all the best and solidarity, and we will see you soon. And thank you to everybody who came and attended, for your questions. Thank you again for your attention, and all the best to everyone in the audience moving forward. You've got a lot of thank yous in the comments.
Thanks everyone. Thank you.
Take good care.